Elias Crow built his life on one unbreakable rule: trust no one. For 20 years, his Montana ranch stood as a fortress of silence. No visitors, no neighbors, no complications. Just him, the land, and the ghosts he kept buried. Then he came home from 3 weeks on the trail and found a stranger inside his house. Not stealing, not hiding, cooking his supper. Most men would have reached for their rifle. Elias did something far more dangerous. He sat down at his own table across from a woman who had no right to be there. That single decision would cost him everything he'd spent 2 decades protecting. If you want to see how one uninvited guest can shatter a man's carefully guarded world, stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The horse knew something was wrong before Elias did. 3 miles from the ranch, the mare's ears swiveled forward, nostrils flaring at something on the wind that didn't belong. Elias felt it in his spine, that animal instinct that 20 years of solitude had sharpened into something close to prophecy. Smoke, not wildfire, not the acrid burn of sagebrush catching lightning. Chimney smoke. The domestic kind that meant warmth, occupation, presence. His jaw tightened. The rifle rested across his saddle, loaded and familiar as his own heartbeat. He'd left the ranch locked tight 3 weeks ago when he'd driven the last of his cattle to market in Billings. The storm that caught him on the return trip had cost him 5 days, but the ranch should have been empty, cold, exactly as he'd left it. The sight that greeted him as he crested the final ridge made his hand still on the reins. Light glowed in his kitchen window. Not the weak flicker of a lantern burning itself out, but the steady illumination of a fire deliberately tended. As he watched, a shadow moved across the glass. Deliberate, unhurried, utterly at ease. Someone was in his house. Elias dismounted 100 yards out, ground-tying the mare in a stand of pine. His boots made no sound on the needle-soft earth as he approached. The Winchester felt cold and certain in his hands, though some distant part of his mind, the part that still remembered civilization, wondered what kind of fool broke into an isolated ranch and then announced themselves with a cooking fire. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar. He could hear movement inside now, the scrape of a pan on iron, the soft splash of water being poured. Humming, Christ, whoever it was, they were humming something low and tuneless while they worked. Elias eased the door open with his boot, rifle raised, finger resting easy on the trigger. The woman at his stove didn't scream. She didn't run, didn't grab for a weapon, didn't so much as drop the wooden spoon in her hand. She simply turned her head, regarded him with eyes the color of creek stones, and said, "You're late. I expected you 2 days ago." For a moment, Elias could only stare. She was maybe 35, though hard living had a way of aging women out here. Dark hair pulled back severe and practical. A plain wool dress that had seen better years but was clean, mended with small, precise stitches. She held herself with the kind of steady composure that came from practice, the stance of someone who'd weathered worse than a rifle pointed at their chest. "This is my house," Elias said. His voice came out rust-rough from 3 weeks of talking only to his horse. "I know." She turned back to the stove, stirring something that smelled improbably like beef stew. Real stew, with potatoes and carrots, and the kind of seasoning he hadn't tasted in years. "You're out of salt, and your flour's been compromised by mice. I threw it out." "You—" He lowered the rifle slightly, more from confusion than any decrease in threat. "You broke into my house, threw out my supplies, and made supper?" "I didn't break anything. The lock on your back door gave out with one good shoulder. That's not breaking, that's poor maintenance." She ladled stew into two bowls, as if he'd invited her to dine, and set them on the table. "Sit. You look like you haven't eaten anything but hardtack since you left." She wasn't wrong. The storm had spoiled most of his supplies, and he'd been rationing jerky and stale biscuits for the better part of a week. But that wasn't the point. "Lady?" He set the rifle on the counter, keeping it within reach. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but my name is Margaret Hale." She sat, picked up her spoon, and met his eyes across the table. "Mrs. Margaret Hale, widow. I've been here 8 days. I swept the floor, washed your dishes, fixed the leak in your roof that was starting to rot the beam above your bed. In return, I've been sleeping in your barn and using your well. I haven't touched anything I couldn't put back or replace." The statement was so matter-of-fact, so utterly devoid of apology or fear, that Elias found himself doing the last thing he'd expected. He sat down, not because she'd convinced him of anything, not because he trusted her. Trust was a luxury he'd abandoned along with most other human comforts. But because his legs ached from 3 weeks in the saddle, and the stew smelled better than anything that had come out of his kitchen in 2 decades, and there was something almost hypnotic about her complete lack of reasonable fear. The first bite made him close his eyes. Beef, tender enough to melt. Potatoes cooked through but not mushy, carrots still holding their shape. And underneath it all, the complex layering of herbs and seasoning that spoke of someone who knew their way around more than just survival cooking. "Where'd you get beef?" His own larder had been down to dried beans and the last of his venison. "Your root cellar. You had 2 jars left. I used one." She ate with small, efficient bites. "I also found where you keep your money." His hand stopped halfway to his mouth. "There's $63 in a tin behind the loose stone by the fireplace," Margaret continued, as calmly as if she were discussing the weather. "I didn't take any of it, but you should know, if someone else breaks in, that's the first place they'll look. Any fool can spot a loose stone." Elias set down his spoon. "Why are you here?" "I needed a place to stay. There's a town 6 miles that way, hotel, boarding house, respectable options that don't involve trespassing." "I know. I came from there." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite hardness, but a settling of features into lines that suggested pain absorbed rather than avoided. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome." "What did you do?" "I was married to the wrong man." She pushed her empty bowl aside. "Edmund Hale, from Philadelphia. He came west to make his fortune in silver mining. Made enemies instead. When the mine collapsed and killed 4 men, blame needed somewhere to land. Edmund was already dead by then. Cave-in took him first, but that didn't matter. His widow was close enough. So they ran you out. They suggested I leave. Strongly." She folded her hands on the table. "I had nowhere to go and no money for travel. So I walked until I found a place that looked abandoned enough not to raise questions. Your ranch fit the criteria. Except it's not abandoned." "No?" For the first time, something like regret crossed her face. "I realize that now. I apologize for the intrusion. I'll leave First Light if you want." She said it like she meant it, but Elias heard the hollowness underneath. First Light would send her back out into territory she'd already learned was hostile. No money, no protection, no prospects beyond the ones that waited for women with nothing and no one to vouch for them. He knew those prospects. They weren't the kind any decent human being forced on another without good reason. "You fixed my roof." "The beam was rotting. Another winter, it would have collapsed." "And you found my money but didn't take it." "It wasn't mine to take." Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her, looking for the con, the angle, the lie that would make sense of this. But Margaret Hale just sat there, spine straight, hands folded, waiting for his judgment with the patient exhaustion of someone who'd already been judged 100 times before. "You want to stay," he said slowly. "I want to survive." Staying would facilitate that. For how long? 2 weeks, maybe 3, long enough to earn some money and figure out my next move. She must have seen something shift in his expression because she added quickly, "I'd pay you. I have some jewelry left. Not much, but it's real silver. A bracelet, 2 rings, and I'd keep working, cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing. This is a ranch, not a boarding house. I know what it is." Her voice stayed level, but steel ran through it now. "I also know you've been living like a hermit for long enough that your dishes have dust in them, and your clothes have holes you can't even see anymore. You need help whether you'll admit it or not. I'm offering. In exchange for room and board. In exchange for not dying alone in the woods before winter." The bluntness of it should have offended him. Instead, it felt like the first honest conversation he'd had in years. No dancing around the truth. No pretty words meant to soften ugly realities. Just a woman backed into a corner, naming her situation for exactly what it was. Elias thought about the 20 years he'd spent building his solitude like a wall, the careful rituals of emptiness, the way he'd convinced himself that wanting nothing meant never being disappointed. He thought about coming home to a dark house, cold stove, Silence so complete it had started to sound like ringing in his ears. 2 weeks, he heard himself say. You stay in the barn, keep your distance, and if I say leave, you go. No arguments. Margaret's shoulders dropped half an inch, the first sign of relief she'd let slip. Agreed. And you cook breakfast before dawn. I don't sleep past 5. I'm usually up by 4. Then we won't have problems. He stood, picked up both bowls. I'll wash these. You should get whatever you have in the barn sorted before dark. She rose, started to say something, then stopped. Whatever she'd been about to offer, thanks probably, or some other useless gesture, she seemed to think better of it. She just nodded and headed for the door. Mrs. Hale, she paused, hand on the frame. That bracelet and the rings, keep them. You'll need something to bargain with when you leave. For a long moment, she didn't move, then quietly, Thank you. After she'd gone, Elias stood at his sink and tried to remember the last time someone had thanked him for anything. The answer didn't come. He washed the bowls, banked the fire, and walked through his house trying to see it the way she must have seen it, dust thick, worn down, slowly surrendering to entropy. She'd swept the floor. He could see the marks in the wood where a broom had passed. Small thing, but his boots weren't tracking dirt anymore. In the barn, lamplight glowed soft through the cracks. He could see her shadow moving inside, settling into whatever corner she'd claimed as temporary shelter. 2 weeks. He could tolerate a stranger for 2 weeks. After that, everything would go back to the way it was, the way he preferred it. But as he lay in his bed that night, staring at the beam she'd patched, good work, solid, the kind that would hold for years, Elias found himself doing something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He wondered what tomorrow would bring. The next morning arrived brutal and cold, the kind of late September dawn that promised an early winter. Elias woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt chicory he'd been making do with, and bacon frying. He found Margaret at his stove again, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime making meals appear out of insufficient ingredients. She'd washed her dress, or found a different one. Either way, she looked slightly less like a refugee and more like a woman who'd decided to take up residence. Morning, she said without turning around. You're up early. I told you I would be. She slid eggs onto a plate. His plate, the chipped one he always used, and set it in front of the chair he'd sat in last night. You take your coffee black, I assume. How'd you know that? You don't have cream or sugar. Seems straightforward. He sat. The eggs were cooked right, whites set, yolks still soft. The bacon was crisp without being burnt. Even the coffee was stronger than he usually managed, perfectly balanced between bitter and drinkable. You're hired, he said before he could stop himself. Margaret glanced over, something that might have been amusement flickering across her features. I thought I already was. For cooking, I meant for cooking. He shoveled eggs into his mouth, trying to recover some dignity. This is good. It's adequate. With better supplies, I could do better. Better supplies cost money. Everything costs money, Mr. Crow. The question is whether you're willing to spend it for quality of life, or if you'd rather save it for the satisfaction of dying with a full bank account. He paused mid-bite. That's a grim way to look at things. That's a realistic way to look at things. You're 40-something, living alone on a ranch that barely breaks even. Unless you're planning on some dramatic change, this is what the next 20 years look like too. I like it this way. Do you? She poured herself coffee, leaned against the counter. Or have you just convinced yourself that preference and resignation are the same thing? Elias set down his fork. You've been here 8 days. Don't presume to know anything about my choices. You're right, I apologize. But she didn't look particularly sorry. What's on the agenda today? Why? Because if I'm staying 2 weeks, I should make myself useful beyond cooking meals you don't even eat at the table. I eat at the table. You eat standing at the counter, or outside, or you skip it entirely. Your chair has dust on it. Or it did, before last night. He wanted to argue, but she wasn't wrong. Sitting down to eat had started to feel like an admission of loneliness, so he'd stopped doing it. Better to grab something and keep moving, keep working, keep the silence at bay with action instead of stillness. Fence needs mending on the north pasture, he said finally, and the barn door's been sticking, probably needs new hinges. I'll take the barn door. I'm not strong enough for fence work. You fixed my roof. I patched a leak. That's different than stringing wire and pounding posts. She rinsed her cup, set it to dry. I'll also need to do laundry today if you want clean sheets. I didn't ask for clean sheets. No, but you need them. When's the last time you washed your bedding? Elias tried to remember. Failed. Recently enough? Define recently. This year. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. I'm washing your sheets. And your other shirts. And that jacket you've got hanging by the door that smells like horse and defeat. It does not. It does. Go do your fence work. I'll manage things here. She said it with such casual authority that Elias found himself standing, following orders in his own house. At the door, he paused. You always this bossy? Only when I'm right. She was already pulling his bedding off with brisk, efficient movements, which, in my experience, is most of the time. Despite himself, something almost like a smile tugged at his mouth. He pushed it down, grabbed his work gloves, and headed out before she could see. The fence work took most of the morning. Simple labor, the kind that let his mind wander while his hands stayed busy. He'd been doing it for so long that the rhythm felt almost meditative. Hammer, wire, twist, move, hammer, wire, twist, move. By noon, he'd repaired 30 yards of fencing and worked up enough appetite to justify heading back to the house for something more substantial than the biscuit he'd shoved in his pocket at dawn. What he found stopped him in the doorway. Every piece of laundry he owned was strung up on lines between the house and barn, snapping in the wind like flags of surrender. Shirts he'd forgotten about, trousers with patches on top of patches. The jacket she'd mentioned, which really did smell better now that he was downwind of it. The barn door hung straight and smooth on its frame, no longer catching on the uneven ground. Someone, Margaret obviously, had planned down the bottom edge and cleaned out years of accumulated dirt and pebbles from the track. Inside, the house looked different, not rearranged. Nothing was in a different place than he'd left it, but cleaner somehow. Ordered. The dishes were washed and stacked, the floor swept again, the windows clear enough that actual sunlight came through instead of the perpetual dim he'd grown accustomed to. Margaret sat at the table, mending one of his shirts. I should have asked before washing everything, she said without looking up. But some of these things were barely holding together. If you'd rather I not... It's fine. He set down his tools, suddenly aware of how dirty his hands were. When had he stopped caring about tracking mud through his own house? You've been busy. Not as busy as you. How's the fence? Holding. For now. He washed his hands in the basin, dried them on a rag that was actually clean for once. You didn't have to do all this. Yes, I did. I'm earning my keep. She bit through a thread, examined her work with a critical eye. Besides, it needed doing. This place was falling apart in slow motion. It was fine. It was barely functional. There's a difference. She set aside the mending, stood. I made sandwiches. They're wrapped in the cupboard if you want one. He did, though he would have denied it if asked directly. The sandwich was thick with sliced venison, cheese he didn't remember having, and some kind of mustard that must have come from her own supplies. Where'd you get this? He gestured with the sandwich. The mustard? I made it. Had some seeds left from Philadelphia. Figured they'd go bad if I didn't use them. You made mustard? It's not complicated. Grinding seeds, vinegar, salt, basic preservation. She poured water into 2 cups, handed him one. Edmund used to say I could make a meal out of dust and determination. He meant it as a compliment, though it never quite felt like one. It was the first time she'd mentioned her late husband without prompting. Elias took a careful bite of sandwich, giving her space to continue or let it drop. He wasn't a bad man, Margaret said after a moment. Just weak. The kind who wanted great things but couldn't endure what it took to achieve them. When the mind started failing, he borrowed money from men you don't borrow from. When that ran out, he borrowed more. By the time the cave-in happened, we owed more than we'd make in 5 lifetimes. And they blamed you. They needed someone to blame who was still breathing. Edmund was dead. The other investors had fled. I was the only one left. She took a small sip of water, as if even that was a luxury she had to ration. They took the house, the furniture, every piece of jewelry except what I managed to hide. Then they suggested I leave town before someone decided that debt could be paid other ways. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Elias had seen enough of the world to know what other ways meant for women with no protection and no options. The fact that Margaret had walked away from it intact said something about either her luck or her survival instincts, probably both. "You could have gone back east," he said. "And be what? A poor relation living on charity, grateful for table scraps and hand-me-downs?" She shook her head. "I'd rather take my chances out here." "Out here will kill you just as fast as Philadelphia. Slower, maybe, but just as permanent. At least here I get to choose how I die." She met his eyes, and there was no fear in them, just a clear-eyed acceptance of odds that weren't in her favor. That's worth something. Elias thought about his own choices, the war that had taught him violence, the woman who'd left him when she realized he couldn't unlearn it, the 20 years he'd spent believing that isolation was the same as peace. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess it is." They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just two people sharing space and food, neither expecting anything from the other beyond the basic respect of existence. When Margaret started clearing the plates, Elias found himself saying, "I'm heading into town tomorrow, for supplies. You can come if you want." She paused. "Are you sure?" "You need things. Fabric, thread, whatever else. Makes sense to go together." "People will talk. People talk anyway. Might as well give them something accurate to gossip about." The corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. "In that case, I accept." After she'd gone back to the barn for the night, Elias sat in his chair, the one without dust on it now, and stared at the fire. The house felt different with someone else in it during the day. Not crowded, just less empty. He told himself it was temporary. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then things would go back to normal. But normal was starting to feel less like peace and more like punishment. And he wasn't sure anymore which one he preferred. Town was 6 miles southeast, a collection of buildings that called itself Bear Creek, despite being nowhere near any significant water source. Elias made the trip once a month for supplies, said as few words as possible, and left before anyone could mistake his presence for sociability. Bringing Margaret complicated things. She rode the spare horse in silence, keeping pace without comment or complaint. She'd changed into her better dress, still plain, still worn, but clean and pressed. Her hair was pinned up, severe and practical. She looked like exactly what she was, a widow of limited means trying to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The first person they passed was Henry Garrett, who owned the feed store. His eyes went from Elias to Margaret and back again, surprise giving way to something calculating. "Crow," he said. "Didn't know you had company." "I don't. Mrs. Hale is staying at my ranch temporarily, separate arrangement." "Sure it is." Henry's tone said he believed exactly nothing. "Mrs. Hale, pleasure." Margaret nodded but didn't speak. Smart woman. Nothing she said would improve the situation. By the time they reached the general store, three more people had seen them together. Elias could practically hear the rumors forming, spreading like fire through dry grass. Inside, the store was run by Pauline Werner, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd been Bear Creek's primary source of both goods and gossip for the last 20 years. Elias Crow. She looked past him to Margaret. "And guessed." "Mrs. Werner, I need the usual supplies, plus fabric if you have it, and thread, needles, anything for mending." "Those for you or the lady?" "Does it matter?" "Matters for my records. Separate purchases or together?" Elias pulled out his money. "Together." Pauline's eyebrows climbed halfway up her forehead, but she started pulling goods without further comment. Margaret moved along the shelves, selecting items with careful consideration, not the choices of someone spending freely, but of someone making every dollar count. "This should do," Margaret said finally, setting a modest pile on the counter. Fabric in dark, practical colors, thread in multiple weights, a packet of needles and a thimble that had seen better days. "That all?" Pauline asked. "For now." "You planning on doing a lot of sewing?" "I always plan on doing a lot of sewing. Clothes don't mend themselves." "No, I suppose they don't." Pauline rang up the purchases with exaggerated care. "Will you be staying in Bear Creek long, Mrs. Hale?" "That depends on circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" "The kind that are my own business." Margaret's voice stayed pleasant, But something in it made Pauline's mouth thin into a disapproving line. Elias paid, gathered the supplies, and headed for the door before anyone else could ask questions designed to confirm suspicions. Outside, they loaded the horses in silence. Margaret worked quickly, her movements efficient and practiced. She'd clearly handled pack animals before. "That went well," she said dryly once they were clear of the main street. "Could have been worse." "How exactly?" "They could have refused to sell to us, or demanded higher prices, or any number of things people do when they want you gone. They already want me gone. They're just being polite about it. For now." Margaret adjusted her reins, looked at him sidelong. "You didn't have to bring me, or buy those supplies. Why did you?" The question was more complicated than it should have been. Elias could have said something about practicality, about how she needed materials if she was going to be useful. Could have deflected with a comment about basic human decency. Instead, he said, "Because you fixed my roof without being asked, and you didn't steal my money. And in 20 years, you're the first person who's walked into my house and treated it like something worth maintaining instead of just somewhere to get through another day." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then, so soft he almost missed it. "Thank you." They rode home without speaking, but something had shifted. Some unspoken understanding that this arrangement, whatever it was, had moved past simple transaction into something neither of them had quite agreed to, but both seemed willing to risk. The days fell into rhythm after that. Elias worked the ranch, fence repair, livestock care, the 1,000 small tasks that kept a property functional. Margaret worked the house, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes that had been one thread away from rags. They ate breakfast together before dawn, dinner at dusk, and spent the hours between in separate orbits that occasionally intersected. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt almost comfortable. One evening, about 10 days into their arrangement, Elias came in from the barn to find Margaret sitting at the table with a shirt of his spread out in front of her, not mending it, just looking at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Something wrong?" She startled slightly, looked up. "This shirt. It's military issue. Modified, but I recognize the pattern." He'd wondered when she'd notice. "Yeah. You served. Civil War, Company F, 1st Montana Infantry." He hung up his coat, moved to the stove where coffee was still warm. "Long time ago." "Not so long that you've forgotten. I can see it in the way you move, the way you scan rooms when you enter them, the way you sleep light. Everyone sleeps light out here. It's practical. It's more than that. You sleep like someone who's been attacked in their bed before." She folded the shirt carefully, set it aside. "Edmund had a friend like that. Came back from Gettysburg different than he left. Used to wake up swinging at shadows." "I don't swing at shadows." "No. You just built a life where shadows can't reach you." Elias poured coffee he didn't want just to have something to do with his hands. "Is there a point to this?" "Just observing. You're good at being alone. Too good. Makes me wonder what you're hiding from." "Maybe I'm not hiding. Maybe I just prefer solitude." There's a difference between preferring something and needing it so badly you'd rather die than give it up. Margaret stood, moved to the window. Outside, the sun was setting in shades of orange and gold, painting the mountains in colors too beautiful for the harsh land beneath them. "I'm not judging. I understand needing distance from things that hurt, but there's distance and there's burial. You've buried yourself so deep, I'm surprised you remember what daylight feels like." "You don't know anything about me." "I know you came home to a stranger in your house and decided to let her stay. That's not the choice of a man who wants to be left alone." She turned, met his eyes. "That's the choice of someone who's finally tired of the life he's been living." The words hit harder than they should have, because she was right, and they both knew it. Elias had spent 20 years convincing himself that isolation was strength, that needing nothing meant he couldn't be hurt. But somewhere in the last 10 days, that conviction had started to crack. Not because of anything dramatic, just because having another person in his space reminded him that survival and living weren't the same thing. 2 weeks is almost up," he said finally. "I know. You could stay longer, if you wanted." Margaret's expression shifted. Surprise, calculation, something else he couldn't name. "Under what terms?" "Same as now. You keep house, I provide shelter and supplies. Nothing more than that." "Nothing?" "Nothing," he confirmed. I'm not asking for anything beyond what we already have. She studied him for a long moment. Why? Because this place works better with two people than one. And because you're right, I have been tired of the life I've been living. Maybe it's time to try something different. Different how? I don't know yet, but I figure we'll find out together. Margaret crossed her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. People already talk. If I stay longer, they'll talk more. Let them. It'll make things harder for both of us. Things are already hard. At least this way, we're not doing it alone. She laughed then, short, sharp, almost bitter. You're either very brave or very stupid, Elias Crow. Probably both. Probably. But she was smiling now, just slightly. All right, I'll stay. On one condition. Which is? You start eating meals at the table, not standing up, not outside, not skipping them entirely. If we're doing this, whatever this is, we do it properly. That's your condition? Sitting down for meals? That's my condition. Small things matter. Especially the ones we've convinced ourselves don't. Elias thought about all the small things he'd let slip over the years. The rituals of normal life that had felt too painful to maintain alone. Somehow, with Margaret demanding them, they didn't feel painful anymore. Just possible. Deal, he said. They shook on it, her hand small and work-roughened in his, the grip firm enough to mean something. And just like that, the temporary arrangement became something neither of them had quite planned for. Something that looked almost like partnership. The arrangement held for 3 more weeks before the town decided to intervene. Elias was in the barn repairing a broken harness when he heard the horses approaching, 4 of them, moving at the deliberate pace of men who'd come with purpose rather than friendliness. He set down his tools, walked to the doorway, and waited. Harold Brennan led the group, town minister, self-appointed moral authority, the kind of man who confused his own opinions with divine mandate. Behind him rode Thomas Yates, who owned the largest ranch in the territory, and 2 men Elias recognized but couldn't name. All of them wore expressions that said they'd rehearsed this conversation and didn't expect to be contradicted. Crow, Brennan said, not bothering to dismount. We need to talk. Then talk. Privately would be better. This is my property, private as it gets. Elias crossed his arms, leaned against the barn frame. Say what you came to say. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he continued. There's been talk about you and the widow Hale, about the nature of her residence here. She lives in the barn. I live in the house. That's the nature. For now, perhaps. But a woman of her station, living alone with a man to whom she's not married, it reflects poorly on the community, on all of us. How does what happens on my ranch reflect on anyone but me? Because we live in a society, Crow. What one person does affects the whole. When you allow impropriety under your roof, there's no impropriety. Mrs. Hale keeps house. I provide shelter. It's an employment arrangement. Thomas Yates spoke up then, his voice carrying the weight of money and influence. Employment arrangements don't typically involve women living on the premises unchaperoned. If you need help with household work, hire someone from town, someone with family, with a reputation to maintain. Not a widow, with questionable circumstances and no one to vouch for her character. Her character is fine, better than most. You've known her a month, Elias. You can't possibly... I know she works harder than anyone I've met. I know she doesn't steal, doesn't lie, and doesn't complain about circumstances that would break most people. That's enough character reference for me. Brennan's expression hardened. This isn't about work ethic. This is about propriety, about what's right in the eyes of the community and in the eyes of... Don't. Elias's voice went flat. Don't bring your doctrine into this. I've heard enough sermons to last a lifetime, and not one of them made the world less cruel. You want to talk about what's right? Fine. What's right is a woman being able to work for her keep without being harassed. What's right is people minding their own business instead of manufacturing scandal where none exists. The scandal exists whether you acknowledge it or not, Yates said. People are talking. And when people talk, it affects business, relationships, the social fabric of the entire territory. We're trying to build something here, Crow. Civilization, order. We can't have that if we allow individuals to flout basic standards of decency. Decency, Elias repeated. You want to talk about decency? Where was the town's decency when Mrs. Hale's husband died and left her with debts she didn't make? Where was the Christian charity when she needed help instead of judgment? You ran her out, made it clear she wasn't welcome, and now you're here telling me I can't offer her work because it looks bad for your precious civilization. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. One of the unnamed men shifted in his saddle. We're not saying she deserves to starve. We're saying there are appropriate ways to help and inappropriate ways. This situation, her living here, working for you without proper supervision, it's inappropriate. Then what's appropriate? Sending her back east with no money? Forcing her into work that pays half what I do and demands twice the indignity? Or maybe you'd prefer she just disappear entirely, make it easier for everyone to forget she existed. We prefer, Brennan said coldly, that you acknowledge the position you're putting this community in and make the necessary adjustments. Either marry the woman and make this legitimate or send her away. Those are the only acceptable options. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elias felt something hot and ugly rise in his chest. The same feeling he'd had during the war when officers gave orders that made no sense but demanded obedience anyway. The feeling that had taught him to distrust authority in all its forms. "Get off my property," he said quietly. "Crow, you heard me. This conversation is over. If you have concerns about how I run my ranch, you can keep them to yourselves. And if you have concerns about Mrs. Hale, you can take them up with her directly. But you don't get to come onto my land and issue ultimatums like you have any authority here. You don't." Yates leaned forward in his saddle. "You're making a mistake. The community has power, Crow. We can make things very difficult for you, if we choose. You can try. But I've survived worse than gossip and social pressure. Test me if you want. See how that works out." For a moment it looked like Brennan might push further. But something in Elias's expression, maybe the flatness in his eyes, maybe the absolute certainty in his stance, convinced him otherwise. "We'll be watching," Brennan said finally. "If anything changes, if there's any evidence of impropriety, we'll take action. You do that. In the meantime, get off my land." They left, but slowly, making sure their departure looked like choice rather than retreat. Elias watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned to find Margaret standing in the doorway of the house. "You heard," he said, "every word." She walked toward him, arms wrapped around herself despite the afternoon warmth. "You should have let me talk to them, explain the situation. Nothing you said would have changed their minds. They came here decided. They're right about one thing. This arrangement, it does look improper, and it's only going to get worse the longer I stay." "So what are you saying? You want to leave?" "I'm saying I don't want to be the reason you lose your standing in the community, or your business. If people stop trading with you because of me, let them. I don't need the community's approval to run my ranch. Everyone needs the community eventually, for supplies, for help, for basic human connection. You can't survive out here completely alone. I've been doing it for 20 years. And look how well that's worked out." The words came sharper than she'd probably intended. Margaret stopped, took a breath. "I'm sorry. I just meant, you meant I've been half alive for 2 decades, and everyone knows it. You're not wrong." Elias rubbed his face, suddenly tired. "But that's my choice, my consequence, not yours. Except now it is mine. Because I'm here. Because you're protecting me from judgment I probably deserve. You don't deserve any of this. You didn't ask for your husband to make bad choices. Didn't ask to be blamed for circumstances beyond your control. And you sure as hell didn't ask to be run out of town by people who call themselves civilized." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, something complicated working behind her eyes. "What they said about the 2 options, marriage or leaving. That's their opinion, not law. But they'll enforce it like law. You know they will. They'll make life difficult until one of us breaks. Then they'll be disappointed, because I don't break easy. Neither do I. But I also don't want to drag you into a fight that's mine to handle." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of darker gray in her eyes. "If I left, went to the next territory, started over somewhere nobody knows my history, you'd be free of this. Free of the judgment and the pressure and all of it. And you'd be alone again, starting from nothing, hoping the next town treats you better than the last one. How's that an improvement? At least it wouldn't be your problem. What if I want it to be my problem? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Why would you want that? Because for the first time in 20 years, I wake up and there's a reason to get out of bed beyond basic survival. Because the house doesn't feel empty anymore. Because I've been alone so long, I forgot what it was like to have someone give a damn whether I lived or died. He stopped, surprised by his own honesty. You being here, it's complicated and inconvenient and probably a dozen other things I haven't figured out yet. But it's not a problem. It's the opposite of a problem. Margaret's expression did something he couldn't quite interpret. Not quite relief, not quite fear. Something in between that spoke to the same complicated mess of feelings he was trying and failing to articulate. They want us to marry, she said slowly, to make it legitimate. They can want whatever they please. Doesn't mean we have to give it to them. No, but it would solve the problem. Give them what they're asking for, remove the scandal, let us both get on with our lives without constantly looking over our shoulders. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're suggesting we actually do it, actually marry. I'm suggesting it's worth considering, not for them, for us. A practical arrangement, same as what we have now, but with legal protection. You get help running the ranch, I get security, and a name that isn't weighted down with debt and judgment. Nobody has to pretend it's more than it is. Marriage is supposed to be more than practical. For some people, maybe. For people like us? She shrugged. Practical might be the best we can manage. And that's not nothing, Elias. A lot of marriages start with less and make do just fine. He wanted to argue. Wanted to say that marriage should mean something beyond social convenience and practical benefit. But who was he to talk about what marriage should mean? His one attempt at it had ended badly enough that he'd spent 20 years avoiding anything that even resembled commitment. I need to think about it, he said finally. Of course, take whatever time you need. Margaret turned to go back to the house, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm not asking because I want to trap you into something. I'm asking because it seems like the path that lets us both keep what we've built here. But if you'd rather I leave, I will. No argument, no resentment, just say the word. I don't want you to leave. Then think about the alternative. Because Brennan and Yates, they're not going to let this rest. They'll keep pushing until something gives. Better we control what gives than let them force our hand. She was right, and Elias knew it. But that didn't make the decision any easier. That night, he sat on his porch long after Margaret had gone to the barn, watching stars emerge against darkening sky. The land stretched out around him, familiar and constant, the same view he'd had for 2 decades. Nothing had changed out there, only inside his house, inside his carefully maintained isolation, where a woman who'd walked in uninvited had somehow become essential. Marriage. The word felt heavy, weighted with memories of failure and promises he hadn't been able to keep. Sarah had married him believing the war wouldn't change who he was. When she realized how wrong she'd been, the disappointment in her eyes had cut deeper than any enemy bullet. But Margaret wasn't Sarah. She'd seen his worst already, the isolation, the damage, the careful distance he kept from anything resembling emotional risk. She wasn't asking him to be different, just to make official what already existed. Maybe that was enough. Maybe, for people like them, practical was the best kind of honest. The next morning, he found her in the kitchen before dawn as always, coffee brewing and breakfast underway. She looked up when he entered but didn't speak, just handed him his usual cup and went back to work. I thought about what you said, Elias began. Margaret stilled, her back to him. And? And you're right, about Brennan and Yates not letting this rest, about needing to control the situation before it controls us. He took a breath. If you're still willing, we can do it. Get married. Make it legal. She turned slowly, studying his face. You're sure? I'm sure I don't want you to leave. I'm sure I'm tired of letting other people dictate how I live my life. Beyond that? He shrugged. I'll figure it out as we go. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's honest, which is more than most people get before they make this kind of decision. A small smile touched her mouth. True enough. She poured herself coffee, leaned against the counter. We should establish some ground rules, make sure we both know what we're agreeing to. All right. This stays practical, a partnership for mutual benefit. I keep house, you provide security and resources. We present a united front to the outside world, but in private, we maintain our own space. No expectations beyond what we've already established. Agreed. And if either of us changes their mind, if this arrangement stops working, we talk about it honestly. No resentment, no blame, just clear communication about what needs to change. Fair. Margaret set down her cup, met his eyes. I mean it, Elias. I don't want you waking up in 5 years resenting me because you felt obligated. If we do this, we do it with clear understanding that it's voluntary. Always. Same goes for you. You're not trapped here, not by marriage, not by circumstance, not by anything. You want to leave? Doors open. Even after we're married? Especially then. I'm not interested in keeping anyone against their will. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded. When? Soon as we can arrange it. No point dragging it out. Brennan will want to perform the ceremony. Make a spectacle of it. Brennan can want whatever he likes. We'll find someone else. Someone who'll keep it simple and legal without the sermon. That's going to upset people. Let them be upset. I'm done making decisions based on what other people think. Margaret laughed then, short and surprised. You know, for someone who's spent 20 years avoiding conflict, you've suddenly gotten very comfortable with it. I've always been comfortable with conflict. I just didn't think anything was worth fighting for. That's changed. Because of me? Because of what you represent. Choice. Agency. The right to build a life on our own terms instead of someone else's expectations. He finished his coffee, set the cup aside. You ready for that? Because once we do this, there's no going back to invisible. We'll be making a statement whether we mean to or not. I'm ready. I've been invisible long enough. Then we do it. This week, if we can manage it. This week, Margaret agreed. They shook on it again, that same firm grip that meant business, not sentiment. But as Elias headed out to start the day's work, he found himself thinking that maybe, for people like them, business and sentiment didn't have to be separate things. Maybe choosing to build something practical together was its own kind of faith. Maybe that was the only kind of faith either of them had left. And maybe that was enough. 3 days later, they rode to the territorial courthouse in Helena, 40 miles north of Bear Creek. The magistrate was a practical man in his 60s who'd seen enough frontier marriages to know better than to ask too many questions. He read through the brief ceremony with perfunctory efficiency, witnessed their signatures, and declared them legally wed in under 10 minutes. Elias paid the fee. Margaret signed her new name carefully, Margaret Crow, and stared at it for a long moment before tucking the certificate into her bag. Outside, the spring afternoon was bright and cool, the kind of day that made promises feel possible. That's it then, Margaret said. That's it. How do you feel? Elias considered the question honestly. Same as this morning, maybe a little lighter. Lighter how? Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time and just set it down. Not sure what it was, but it feels good to be rid of it. Margaret nodded slowly. I know what you mean. Like we've been living under someone else's rules and just decided to make our own. Something like that. They mounted their horses, started the long ride back. Halfway home, Margaret spoke again. When we get back to Bear Creek, people are going to expect things. A celebration, probably. Questions about the wedding, about our plans, about why we did it so quickly and quietly. Let them expect. We don't owe anyone explanations. No, but we should probably have a story. Something consistent that we both tell. The truth works fine. We're practical people who made a practical decision. Anyone who needs more than that is looking for gossip, not information. You're very good at not caring what people think. I spent 20 years caring too much. Got exhausting. This is easier. Margaret was quiet for a while after that, just the sound of hooves on hard-packed earth and wind through the grass. Then, carefully, you know this doesn't have to stay completely practical forever. If things change, if we want to adjust the arrangement, we said we'd talk about it if that happened. Honest communication, remember? I remember. I just wanted to make sure you know the option exists, that I'm not... She stopped, started over. That I'm not opposed to things evolving, if they do. Elias glanced at her, saw something vulnerable in her expression that she was trying to hide behind practical words. It occurred to him that she might be feeling the same complicated mess of emotions he'd been wrestling with. The sense that this arrangement, however practical, had the potential to become something else. something neither of them had quite agreed to, but both were starting to consider. "Noted," he said. "And likewise, if things change, we'll figure it out together." "Together," Margaret repeated, like she was testing the word. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, watching the sun drop toward the mountains and painting everything in shades of gold. By the time they reached the ranch, full dark had fallen and the stars were out in force, so many you could get lost counting them. Inside the house, Margaret moved through the familiar routine of making supper while Elias tended the horses. When he came back, she'd set 2 plates at the table. Nothing special, nothing celebratory. Just the same meal they'd have had any other night. Except she'd moved her things from the barn. Elias saw them in the corner, her bag, her few possessions stacked neatly against the wall where his rifle usually leaned. "I figured," Margaret said without turning around, "that married people probably shouldn't live in separate buildings. Appearances and all." "Makes sense. I can sleep in the spare room. Give us both privacy." "All right. Unless you'd rather I stay in the barn. I don't want to presume—" "Margaret." He waited until she looked at him. "You're my wife now. You should live in the house. We'll figure out the rest as we go." She nodded, visibly relieved. "The rest as we go. I can work with that." They ate in silence, but it was the kind of silence that felt settled rather than uncomfortable. After, Margaret cleaned up while Elias checked the doors and windows. Old habit from the war that he'd never quite broken. By the time he finished, she'd disappeared into the spare room. Elias stood in his empty bedroom and realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't alone in his house. Wasn't alone in his life. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt almost like relief. He'd spent so long believing that solitude was safety, that needing no one meant no one could hurt him. But solitude had its own kind of pain. The slow erosion of purpose, the gradual forgetting of why anything mattered. Margaret's presence reminded him that mattering wasn't about being invulnerable. It was about choosing connection despite the risk, building something with someone else even when you couldn't guarantee it would last. That night, lying in his bed and listening to the small sounds of another person settling into sleep down the hall, Elias thought about the word she'd used earlier. Together. Maybe that was the real risk they were taking. Not marriage, not social judgment, not any of the practical concerns that had led them here, but the possibility that together might start to mean something beyond convenience, that it might start to feel like home. News of the marriage reached Bear Creek before they did. By the time Elias and Margaret made their next supply run, 2 weeks after the quiet ceremony in Helena, the entire town had already formed opinions, some congratulatory, most skeptical, a few openly hostile. Pauline Werner greeted them at the general store with a smile so tight it looked painful. "Mrs. Crow?" she said, emphasizing the name like a test. "Heard you two made things official." "We did." Margaret's voice stayed level, giving nothing away. "We'll need flour, sugar, and coffee, if you have it." "Of course." Pauline moved behind the counter, but her eyes never left them. "Quite sudden, wasn't it? The marriage." "We saw no reason to wait." "No, I suppose you wouldn't, given the circumstances." The implication hung heavy between them. Elias set coins on the counter with more force than necessary. "The flour, Mrs. Werner. Unless there's some reason you can't sell it to us." "No reason at all, just making conversation." But her smile had teeth in it. "You'll want to talk to Reverend Brennan, I imagine. He likes to give blessings to newlyweds. Make sure they start off on the right foot spiritually." "We'll pass, thanks. Suit yourself. Though people do notice when couples skip the traditional courtesies. Makes them wonder what you're trying to avoid." Margaret's hand tightened on the counter edge, but her expression stayed calm. "We're not avoiding anything. We're simply private people who prefer to keep our business our own. Privacy's one thing, secrecy's another." Pauline wrapped their purchases with exaggerated care. "But I'm sure you know what you're doing, both of you." Outside, Margaret didn't speak until they'd loaded the supplies and mounted their horses. Then, quietly, "That went better than I expected." "Better how?" "She didn't refuse to serve us. That's something. The bar's pretty low if that counts as success." "Out here? Yes, it is." Margaret adjusted her reins, looked toward the far end of town where a small group had gathered to watch them. "They're all doing the same calculation. trying to figure out if we're legitimate or just putting on a show. Let them calculate. Doesn't change anything. It changes how they treat us, how willing they are to trade to help if we need it, to accept us as part of the community. She paused. Not that you care about being part of the community. I care when it affects you. Since when? The question wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. Elias considered it as they rode slowly down the main street, aware of every pair of eyes tracking their progress. Since I realized that keeping you safe might require more than just avoiding town, he said finally. You were right before. Everyone needs the community eventually, even me, especially now. Because I'm here. Because we're building something that's bigger than just surviving another winter. That means people, resources, connections. All the things I've been avoiding. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You know, when I first suggested marriage, I thought it would make things simpler. Give them what they wanted, remove the scandal. But it's actually made things more complicated, hasn't it? Different kind of complicated. Before they could dismiss us as improper. Now they have to acknowledge we're legitimate, even if they don't like it. That's harder to fight. Unless they find another reason to object. They will. People always do. Question is whether we give them ammunition or make them work for it. They passed the church where Harold Brennan stood on the steps talking to Thomas Yates. Both men stopped mid-conversation to watch the newlyweds ride by. Brennan's expression was unreadable, but Yates looked openly displeased. They're planning something, Margaret said once they were out of earshot. Probably. That doesn't worry you? Worrying won't stop them. Better to focus on what we can control. Which is? Making sure our story is solid. Making sure we give them no reason to question the legitimacy of this marriage. He glanced at her. That means acting like a married couple when we're in public, not just practical partners. Act how exactly? I don't know. How do married couples act? Margaret laughed, sharp and sudden. You're asking me? My marriage to Edmund was a disaster from start to finish. We barely spoke the last 6 months. I'm not exactly an expert on domestic harmony. Then we figure it out together, make it up as we go. That seems to be our approach to everything. It's worked so far. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts about what performance marriage might require and whether they were capable of delivering it. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dropping toward evening and the air had turned cool with the promise of a cold night ahead. Inside, Margaret started supper while Elias tended the horses. The routine had become so familiar that they moved through it without needing to discuss who did what. She knew he'd check the barn before coming in. He knew she'd have coffee ready when he did, small things, but they added up to something that felt almost like partnership. Over dinner, Margaret said, We should probably talk about the spare room. Elias paused mid-bite. What about it? I've been sleeping there for 2 weeks, and it's fine. The arrangement works. But if anyone ever visits, if anyone ever sees that we're not actually sharing a bedroom, she trailed off, looking uncomfortable. It's evidence that this marriage isn't real. It is real. We signed papers, made it legal. You know what I mean. Real in the sense that people expect. Intimate. The word hung between them like something fragile. Elias set down his fork. Are you saying you want to move into my room? I'm saying we should consider the optics. If Brennan or Yates ever had reason to search the house, or if someone came by unexpectedly and saw separate bedrooms, it gives them ammunition, makes it look like a marriage of convenience, which is exactly what they suspect. It is a marriage of convenience, but they don't need proof of that. Right now it's just suspicion. We should keep it that way. She wasn't wrong. Elias knew enough about how people thought to understand that separate bedrooms would be damning evidence if anyone ever had cause to investigate. But the idea of sharing his space so completely, of giving up the last private territory he had, made something in his chest tighten. I don't sleep well, he said finally. Bad dreams sometimes. From the war. I wake up rough, not always sure where I am. You'd be safer with your own space. Safer from what? You think you'd hurt me? I think I might scare you, and I'd rather not. Margaret studied him across the table, her expression softer than he'd seen it. Elias, I've been married before. I know what nightmares look like. Edmund had them too, not from war, but from the mine. The collapse, the men who died. He'd wake up shouting, sometimes swinging. I learned to handle it. That doesn't mean you should have to handle it again. Maybe not. But if we're doing this, if we're really committing to this marriage being seen as legitimate, then we do it properly. That means shared space, shared life, even the difficult parts. You're sure? I'm sure that the risk of you having nightmares is less than the risk of someone finding out we're living like strangers under the same roof. We can figure out the rest. Elias wanted to argue, but her logic was sound. And underneath the practical reasoning, he could hear something else. An offer to share not just space, but burden. To acknowledge that marriage, even the practical kind, meant carrying each other's weight sometimes. All right, he said, we'll share the room. But if it becomes a problem, if I'm keeping you awake or making things difficult, you tell me. No suffering in silence to preserve appearances. Deal. Same goes for you. If having me there is too much, you speak up. They shook on it again, that now familiar gesture that marked their agreements. But this time, Elias noticed how her hand lingered in his just slightly longer than necessary, how her fingers were calloused from work but still somehow softer than his, how the simple touch made him aware of all the ways they'd been carefully not touching since the marriage. That night, Margaret moved her few belongings into his room, now their room. She took the far side of the bed without being asked, set her things on the dresser with minimal disruption, and changed in the spare room before returning in a nightgown that was practical and modest and revealed absolutely nothing. Elias blew out the lamp, settled into his side of the bed, and tried not to think about how strange it felt to have another person there. How he could hear her breathing in the darkness, feel the slight shift of the mattress when she moved. Elias? Her voice came quiet through the dark. Yeah? Thank you for not making this harder than it has to be. Same to you. Silence settled after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just two people sharing space, learning the rhythm of each other's presence. Elias lay awake longer than he wanted to, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, but eventually exhaustion won and he drifted into sleep. The nightmare came around 3 a.m. It always started the same. The battle at Fort Stevens, the charge that went wrong, the friend who died because Elias had zigged when he should have zagged, gunfire and screaming and the smell of blood thick enough to choke on. He was reaching for his rifle, trying to reload, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. Elias! The voice cut through the dream like a knife. He came awake hard and fast, hand already reaching for the weapon that wasn't there, heart hammering against his ribs. Margaret sat beside him in the dark, hand on his shoulder, not restraining, just present. You're home, she said quietly. You're safe. The war is over. It took several seconds for the words to penetrate, for his breathing to slow enough that he could focus on where he actually was instead of where his mind had been. The bedroom, the ranch, Montana, not Virginia, 20 years removed from any battlefield. I'm sorry, he managed. Did I wake you? You were talking in your sleep. Not loud, but enough. She didn't move her hand from his shoulder. Do you want to talk about it? No? Do you want water? Coffee? No, I'm fine. Go back to sleep. But Margaret didn't lie back down. She just sat there, hand steady on his shoulder, waiting. After a moment, Elias realized she was giving him space to fall apart if he needed to. Permission to be less than perfectly controlled. Fort Stevens, he said, the words coming without his permission. Battle in Virginia, summer of '64. We were supposed to hold a position, didn't work out, lost good men because the orders were bad and nobody had the sense to disobey them. You blame yourself. I survived. They didn't. Doesn't take much math to figure out who made the wrong choices. Or maybe nobody made wrong choices. Maybe war is just chaotic and cruel, and sometimes people die for no good reason at all. Elias looked at her in the darkness, could just barely make out her expression. You sound like you know something about that. Edmund died in a mine collapse that shouldn't have happened. Bad timber, cut corners, owners who valued profit over safety. He and 3 other men crushed because someone decided saving money was worth risking lives. Her hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. I spent a long time trying to figure out who to blame. Edmund for working there, the owners for being cheap, myself for not insisting we leave sooner. Eventually I realized blame doesn't bring anyone back. It just keeps you stuck. So what do you do instead? You survive. You honor the dead by living better than they could. And you stop punishing yourself for having the audacity to still be breathing. The words hit harder than they should have. Elias felt something crack open in his chest, some old wound that had never quite healed because he'd never let it. He'd spent 20 years convinced that isolation was penance for survival, that if he stayed alone, stayed apart, somehow that balanced the scales of men who died while he lived. But Margaret's presence, her calm acceptance, her refusal to let him wallow, suggested a different possibility. That maybe survival wasn't something to be punished. Maybe it was just what happened, and the only real choice was what you did with it afterward. The nightmares don't stop, he said quietly. They've been happening for 20 years. They're not going anywhere. I know. But at least you don't have to wake up to them alone anymore. That's something. She was right. It was something. Margaret settled back down beside him, and this time Elias didn't lie rigid and alert. He let himself relax into the mattress, let himself accept that another person sharing his space wasn't a threat, just different. He slept better after that than he had in months. Morning came cold and sharp, frost on the windows and breath visible in the early air. Elias woke to find Margaret already up, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. He dressed and followed the scent to find her making breakfast with the same efficient grace she brought to everything. "Sleep all right?" she asked without looking up. "Better than expected. You?" "Same." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from people who'd learned they didn't need to fill every moment with talk. After, Margaret said, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about acting like a married couple in public." "What about it?" "We should probably practice, figure out what that looks like before we're put on the spot again." "Practice how?" She turned to face him, something almost mischievous in her expression. "Well, married couples usually show some kind of physical affection, don't they? Hold hands, stand close, that sort of thing. But we've been carefully avoiding touching except for handshakes. If we suddenly start in public, it's going to look forced." Elias saw where she was going. "So you want to practice being comfortable with each other?" "Exactly. Make it natural so it doesn't look like we're performing." "That's surprisingly tactical. I was married to the man who made bad deals for a living. I learned to think strategically about appearances." She held out her hand. "Come here." He crossed to her, suddenly aware of how strange it was that they'd been married 3 weeks and barely touched beyond that one night when he'd had the nightmare. Margaret took his hand, pulled him close enough that he could smell the soap she used. "This feel weird to you?" she asked. "A little?" "Good. Means we need more practice." She placed his hand on her waist, rested her own on his shoulder, like they were about to dance. "The goal is to get comfortable enough that we can do this in town without thinking about it. In town, in front of everyone. Especially in front of everyone. They need to see that we're legitimate. That means looking like we actually want to be married." Elias couldn't argue with the logic, but standing this close to her made him aware of all kinds of things he'd been studiously ignoring. The way she fit against him, the warmth of her hand through his shirt, the fact that she was looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite clinical anymore. "You're overthinking," Margaret said. "I'm thinking the right amount. You're tense as a bowstring. Relax. We're married. We're allowed to stand close to each other. Doesn't make it less strange. Then get used to strange, because this is our life now." She paused. "Unless you'd rather not." "If this is too much..." "It's not too much. It's just new. New isn't bad. New is just different." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "We've gotten through everything else by figuring it out as we go. This isn't any different." She was right, as usual. Elias made himself relax, let his hand settle more naturally at her waist instead of hovering awkwardly. Margaret smiled, small but genuine, and stepped back. "Better. We'll keep practicing. Make it second nature." "You're very good at this." "The strategizing. I had to be. Edmund wasn't. Someone needed to think ahead." She started clearing breakfast dishes. "But that's old history. We're writing new history now. Better history." The phrase stayed with Elias as he went about the day's work. Better history. The idea that the past didn't have to dictate the future. That two people who'd both been burned by life could choose to build something different together. It was such a simple concept, but after 20 years of believing his story was already written and finished, The possibility of revision felt almost revolutionary. That afternoon, a rider approached the ranch. Elias saw him coming from a distance. Older man on a good horse, moving with purpose. As he got closer, Elias recognized Jacob Whitmore, one of the few people in Bear Creek he actually respected. Jacob ran a small farm on the eastern edge of town, kept to himself, didn't involve himself in the social politics that seemed to consume everyone else. "Whitmore," Elias said as the man dismounted, "what brings you out here?" "Wanted to congratulate you and the new Mrs. Crow. Heard you two got married." Jacob's weathered face creased into a smile. "About time someone around here did something sensible instead of making everything complicated." "You think getting married was sensible?" "I think finding a good woman and making it official before anyone could interfere was sensible. Smart, too. Margaret's got a sharp mind and a strong back. You could do a lot worse." "That's what I figured." Jacob glanced toward the house where Margaret had appeared in the doorway. "Mind if I say hello?" "My wife sent preserves. She figured you two might appreciate something sweet." "Come on in." Margaret greeted Jacob with the same practical warmth she brought to everything, accepted the preserves with genuine thanks, and insisted he stay for coffee. The three of them sat at the table, the same table where Elias had first sat across from an uninvited stranger and made the decision that led to everything after. "I'll be straight with you," Jacob said after some small talk. "Brennan and Yates have been making noise about your marriage, claiming it's not legitimate, that you two are putting on a show to avoid judgment. Let them talk. They're planning more than talk. Yates has been approaching the other ranchers, suggesting they stop trading with you, trying to isolate you economically." Margaret's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Can he do that?" "He can try. Question is whether anyone listens. Yates has influence, but he's not universally liked. A lot of people resent the way he throws his weight around." Jacob looked between them. "I wanted you to know what you're up against. And I wanted you to know that some of us, not many, but some, think what you're doing is your own business. We're not interested in Brennan's moral crusade or Yates's power games." "We appreciate that," Elias said. "Appreciate it by being smart. Don't give them ammunition. Make sure everyone sees that this marriage is real, that you two are building a life together. The more legitimate you look, the harder it is for them to make their case." After Jacob left, Margaret turned to Elias. "He's right. We need to be visible, active, show the community that we're not hiding. I thought we didn't care what they think." "We don't care about their judgment, but we can't afford their interference. If Yates succeeds in cutting us off economically, if no one will trade with us, if we can't get supplies, we're in real trouble. Then what do you suggest?" "We go into town more often. We're seen together. We attend public events, make ourselves part of the community instead of apart from it. We show them that we're not ashamed of this marriage, that we're not hiding from anyone." Elias hated the idea, hated the performance of it, the strategic necessity of proving something that should have been taken on faith. But he couldn't argue with the logic. "All right," he said, "we play their game. Show them what they want to see, not what they want to see. What's actually true? That we're married, that we're building a life, that we have every right to do it on our own terms. And if it's not enough, if they find a way to make trouble anyway?" Margaret's expression hardened into something that reminded Elias why he'd let her stay in the first place, that core of steel beneath the practical exterior. "Then we fight," she said simply. "We've both survived worse than gossip and social pressure. We can survive this too." He believed her. More than that, he trusted her. Somewhere in the weeks since she'd walked into his house uninvited, Margaret had become the kind of partner he'd never thought he'd find. Not just someone to share space with, but someone to stand beside when things got difficult. Someone worth fighting for. That night, lying in their shared bed with Margaret asleep beside him, Elias thought about all the ways his life had changed in such a short time. The silence he'd treasured had been replaced with conversation. The isolation he'd convinced himself was freedom had given way to partnership. The careful distance he'd maintained from anything resembling emotional risk had crumbled in the face of a woman who'd seen his worst and chosen to stay anyway. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost like hope. Hope lasted exactly 3 weeks before the past came calling. The carriage appeared on a Wednesday afternoon, elegant and expensive and entirely out of place on the rough Montana road leading to their ranch. Elias saw it from the north pasture, where he was replacing rotted fence posts, the gleam of polished wood and brass fittings catching sunlight like a warning. He dropped his tools and headed for the house at a pace just short of running. Margaret was hanging laundry when the carriage pulled into the yard, 4 horses breathing hard from the climb. She stilled, wet sheet forgotten in her hands, as a driver in formal livery climbed down to open the door. The man who emerged looked like he'd stepped out of a Philadelphia drawing room. Expensive suit, immaculate grooming, the kind of polish that money bought and maintained. Mid-50s, graying at the temples, carrying himself with the assurance of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Behind him came a woman of similar age and bearing, dressed in black silk that had no business in frontier territory. She surveyed the ranch with the expression of someone inspecting a particularly unsavory specimen. Elias reached Margaret's side just as the man approached, hand extended in a gesture that was more command than greeting. "Margaret," the man said, "it's been too long." Margaret didn't take his hand. "Lawrence, Victoria, what are you doing here?" "We've come to talk. Surely you can spare a few moments for family." "We're not family anymore. That ended when Edmund died and you blamed me for it." The woman, Victoria, made a sound of refined disapproval. "That's not entirely fair, dear. We were all grieving. Sometimes grief makes us say things we don't mean." "You meant every word. You made that very clear when you took everything I had and suggested I leave Philadelphia before worse happened." Lawrence's expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered behind it. "We were concerned for your welfare. A young widow in difficult circumstances. It seemed prudent to help you make a fresh start." "Help?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Is that what you call it now?" Elias stepped forward, putting himself slightly between Margaret and the visitors. "I'm Elias Crow, Margaret's husband, and unless you have business here, you should probably get back in that fancy carriage and head back wherever you came from." Lawrence's eyes shifted to him, assessment swift and thorough. "Ah, the new husband. We heard about that. Quite sudden, wasn't it? Not your concern?" "Actually, it is our concern. Margaret is still tied to the Hale family, however distantly. Her choices reflect on us. Her choices are her own, and her name is Crow now." Victoria moved closer, her gaze sweeping over Margaret with something between pity and disdain. "Darling, we need to talk. Privately. Woman to woman. Surely your new husband can give us a few moments." "No," Margaret said flatly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Elias." Lawrence exchanged a glance with Victoria, then sighed as if dealing with a particularly difficult child. "Very well. We'll be direct. We've come to make you an offer, a generous one." "I don't want anything from you. Hear us out, please." He gestured toward the house. "May we at least sit?" The journey was long, and Victoria's health isn't what it was. Margaret looked at Elias. He could see the conflict in her expression, the part of her that wanted to refuse, to send them away without giving them an inch, warring with the ingrained politeness that had been beaten into her by years of trying to survive in their world. "Fine," she said finally, "but this doesn't change anything." Inside, the contrast between the Hales' refined appearance and the simple ranch house couldn't have been starker. Victoria sat as if the chair might contaminate her dress. Lawrence surveyed the space with barely concealed distaste. Margaret didn't offer tea or make any pretense of hospitality. She just sat at the table, spine straight, and waited. Lawrence pulled an envelope from his jacket, set it on the table between them. "We've been watching your situation, the hasty marriage, the isolation, the difficult circumstances, and we feel, Victoria and I both feel, that we may have been too harsh in our initial response to Edmund's death." "Too harsh," Margaret repeated. "You destroyed my life and called it concern." "We were protecting the family reputation. You must understand, Edmund's debts, the mine disaster, the lawsuits, it was a catastrophe. Someone had to manage the damage. You were collateral in that process, and for that, we apologize." The apology sounded rehearsed. Elias watched Margaret's face and saw she knew it too. "What's in the envelope?" she asked. "A solution for everyone." Lawrence pushed it toward her. $50,000, enough to start fresh anywhere you choose, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life without worrying about money or security. The number hung in the air like smoke. Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. $50,000 was more money than he'd see in 3 lifetimes of ranching, enough to transform everything about Margaret's existence, from survival to comfort. In exchange for what? Margaret's voice stayed steady, but her hands had clenched in her lap. A clean break. You sign papers renouncing any claim to the Hale name, any potential inheritance, any connection to the family business. You go back east, or anywhere else you prefer, and you live your life without any further entanglement with us. And Elias? Victoria spoke for the first time since entering the house. Surely you can see this marriage was born of desperation, not genuine affection, a rushed arrangement to avoid scandal. The poor man probably feels trapped. We're offering you both an escape. He's not trapped, and neither am I. Darling, be realistic. Look at this place. Look at your life here. Is this really what you want? Scrubbing floors, cooking meals, playing house with a man you barely know? You were raised for better things. I was raised to be decorative and compliant, to marry well and produce heirs and never ask inconvenient questions about where the money came from or who got hurt making it. Margaret's voice hardened. This life might be simple, but at least it's honest. At least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. Lawrence leaned forward, his tone shifting to something meant to sound reasonable. We're not asking you to pretend. We're offering you freedom, real freedom. The money is yours, no strings attached beyond severing legal ties. You can use it however you want. Travel, education, a proper home in a real city. You could even keep this arrangement if you're genuinely attached to it. The money would make everything easier. Elias watched Margaret's face, saw the flicker of temptation cross it before she locked it down. He couldn't blame her. $50,000 was freedom from worry, from struggle, from the constant calculation of survival that defined frontier existence. It was everything she'd lost when Edmund died, and all she had to do was walk away from what they'd built together. I need to think about it, Margaret said finally. Of course. Lawrence stood, smoothing his jacket. Take all the time you need. We're staying at the hotel in Bear Creek for the week. Send word when you've decided. After they left, the silence in the house felt suffocating. Margaret sat at the table, staring at the envelope. Elias remained standing by the door, afraid that if he moved or spoke, he'd say something that would make this worse. Finally, Margaret picked up the envelope, turned it over in her hands. You should probably know what you're thinking. I'm thinking that's a lot of money. It is. I'm thinking it would solve a lot of problems. It would. And I'm thinking that if you take it, I won't blame you. Margaret's head snapped up. You wouldn't? How could I? They're offering you security, comfort, freedom from all of this. He gestured at the house, at the life they'd cobbled together from scraps and stubbornness. I've got nothing to compete with that. Nothing I can offer that comes close to $50,000. You're saying I should take it. I'm saying it's your choice, and whatever you choose, I'll understand. Would you? Understand? She stood, faced him across the table. Or would you just convince yourself it's what you expected all along? That people always leave? That nothing good lasts? That you were right to keep everyone at arm's length for 20 years? The accuracy of it stung. Maybe. That's not fair, Elias, to you or to me. We've built something here, something real. And you're ready to just let it go, let me go, because some rich people showed up with a big check? I'm trying not to trap you. I'm trying to give you actual choice instead of making you feel obligated because we signed papers. I know what obligation feels like. This isn't it. She moved around the table toward him. When I married Edmund, it was obligation. His family picked me because I was suitable, good bloodline, decent dowry, trained in all the right social graces. I played my part perfectly and hated every moment. When he died and they blamed me, part of me was almost relieved, because at least I didn't have to pretend anymore. Margaret, let me finish. When I walked into this house, I wasn't looking for another marriage. I was looking for survival, a place to catch my breath before the world finished crushing me. But then you did something unexpected. You saw me. Not the widow, not the scandal, not the obligation, just me, a person trying not to drown, and you threw me a line without asking for anything in return. You've earned your keep 10 times over. That's not what I mean, and you know it. You gave me dignity, choice. The freedom to be useful instead of decorative, that's worth more than any amount of money. Elias wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that what they had was worth more than $50,000 and the security it represented. But doubt was a hard habit to break. "They're not wrong about one thing," he said. "We did rush this. We barely knew each other when we got married. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe we've been telling ourselves it's more than it is because it's easier than admitting the truth." "What truth?" "That this is temporary. That eventually you'll realize you could do better. That I'm not enough to keep you here when the world is offering you everything I can't provide." Margaret closed the distance between them, grabbed his face in both hands with enough force that he had no choice but to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. I've had everything the world thought I should want. Big house, important family, social standing, all of it. And I was miserable every single day because none of it was mine. None of it was chosen. It was just the life that happened to me while I was trying to survive it. That doesn't mean this is better." "Doesn't it? I wake up every morning knowing exactly what I'm doing and why. I work hard, yes, but I keep what I earn. The satisfaction, the pride, the simple fact of making something better with my own hands. I share meals with someone who actually sees me instead of just what I represent. I go to bed every night in a house that feels like home instead of a museum." Her grip tightened. "That's not desperation, Elias. That's choice. The first real choice I've made in my entire life. And if you change your mind, if this stops being enough, then I'll tell you. Because that's what we agreed. Honest communication, no resentment. But I'm not going to preemptively run away because you're too scared to believe someone might actually want to stay." The words hit like a physical blow. Elias felt the careful walls he'd built start to crumble, the defense mechanisms he'd relied on for 20 years proving useless against Margaret's brutal honesty. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "The trust part. The believing someone won't leave part. Sarah, my first wife, she tried for 3 years to make it work. 3 years of watching me get worse instead of better, watching the war damage spread like rot until there was nothing left worth saving. When she finally left, I told myself I deserved it, that I was better off alone. You weren't better off. You were just alone. There's a difference." Felt the same. "I know it did. But it's not. Being alone is safe, but it's not living. It's just waiting to die without having to risk anything in between." Margaret's voice softened. "I'm not Sarah, Elias. I'm not expecting you to be someone you're not. I knew what I was getting into when I stayed. A complicated man with damage and nightmares and 20 years of practiced isolation. That's who you are. And that's who I chose." "Why?" "Because that same complicated man let a stranger into his house and gave her a chance when he had every reason not to. Because he stood up to the town council for me. Because he married me to give me legitimacy, even though marriage was the last thing he wanted. Because every single day he chooses to be kind when it would be easier to be cruel." She let go of his face, stepped back slightly. "You think you're not enough, but you're the first person in my life who's ever treated me like I'm enough. That matters. More than money. More than comfort. More than anything the Hales could offer." Elias stared at her, this woman who'd walked into his life uninvited and turned everything upside down, who'd seen through his defenses and refused to let him hide behind them, who was standing here telling him he mattered when he'd spent 20 years convinced he didn't. "If you stay," he said slowly, "things won't get easier. The town will keep making trouble. Yates and Brennan won't give up. We'll struggle with money and resources and all the same things we're struggling with now. That 50,000 could change everything. I don't want everything changed. I want what we're building, even if it's hard, especially because it's hard." Margaret picked up the envelope, walked to the stove and tossed it into the fire without opening it. "There, decision made." "Margaret, no. I'm done talking about it. I'm done giving them power over my choices. They came here to buy me off, to make me feel like this life isn't good enough, like I should be ashamed of choosing simplicity over sophistication. But I'm not ashamed. I'm proud. Proud of what we've built, proud of who I'm becoming, proud that I finally had the courage to choose something for myself instead of letting other people choose for me." The envelope caught flame, curled in on itself, turned to ash. $50,000 disappearing like it had never existed. Elias felt something break open in his chest, some last piece of armor he'd been clinging to finally giving way. He crossed to Margaret, pulled her into his arms with none of the careful practice they'd been doing. Just need and relief and gratitude too big to contain. She held him back just as tightly, face buried against his shoulder. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "For what?" "For staying. For choosing this. For choosing me." "You're welcome, but Elias." "Yeah? You need to choose too. Not just accept that I'm here, but actually choose to want me here. Choose to trust that I'm not going anywhere. Choose to believe this is real." She was right. Elias had been so focused on giving Margaret choice, on not trapping her, that he'd forgotten he had a choice too. To trust or retreat. To risk or hide. To live or merely survive. He'd been surviving for 20 years. Maybe it was time to try the other thing. "I choose you," he said. "I choose this. I choose us." Margaret pulled back enough to look at him, eyes bright with something that might have been tears. "Say that again." "I choose us." "Good. Because I'm going to hold you to that." She smiled then, fierce and beautiful. "Now we should probably go to town tomorrow and tell Lawrence and Victoria where they can put their offer." "You want to tell them in person?" "I want to make sure they understand that I'm not running anymore, that I've found where I belong and no amount of money is going to change that." The next morning they rode into Bear Creek together, Margaret wearing her best dress, and Elias in clothes that didn't smell like horse and hard work. The hotel where the Hales were staying was the nicest building in town, which wasn't saying much by Philadelphia standards, but represented luxury in frontier terms. Lawrence and Victoria were taking breakfast in the dining room when Elias and Margaret walked in. Their expressions shifted from pleased expectation to confusion when they saw Margaret's face. "We've decided," Margaret said without preamble. "Wonderful." Lawrence set down his coffee. "When would you like to finalize the paperwork?" "We won't be finalizing anything. The answer is no." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Victoria recovered first, her composure cracking just slightly. "Darling, perhaps you should think about this more carefully. 50,000 is an extraordinary sum." "I don't need to think about it. I'm staying here, with my husband, living the life I've chosen." "Chosen?" Lawrence's voice took on an edge. "Or settled for because you don't think you have better options?" "I have better options. You just offered me one. And I'm telling you I prefer this." Margaret gestured to Elias, to herself, to the life they represented. "I prefer honesty over appearances. I prefer partnership over obligation. I prefer being valued for what I do instead of what I represent." "You prefer poverty over comfort, isolation over society, a rough rancher over proper family." Victoria's disgust was barely contained now. Edmund would be ashamed. Edmund would understand. He spent his whole life trying to be what you wanted him to be, and it killed him. "I'm not making that same mistake." Lawrence stood, any pretense of civility abandoned. "This is foolish, Margaret. We're offering you freedom, real freedom, not this play acting at frontier life with a man you barely know. I know him better than I ever knew Edmund, better than I knew myself when I was trying to be the person you wanted. And this freedom you're offering, it comes with chains. Severing ties, renouncing claims, agreeing to disappear and never bother you again. That's not freedom. That's erasure. That's protection, for you and for us. You don't get to protect me anymore. You gave up that right when you blamed me for Edmund's failures and threw me out with nothing." Elias watched the exchange with grim satisfaction. This was Margaret at her strongest. Not the woman who'd walked into his house desperate and afraid, but the one who'd learned to fight for what mattered. Victoria tried one more time, voice dripping with false concern. "Think of your future, dear. What happens when this romance fades? When you're old and tired and regret choosing hardship over comfort? You'll have nothing. No family, no support, no security." "I'll have myself. I'll have my dignity. I'll have the knowledge that I lived on my own terms instead of yours." Margaret took Elias's hand, held it where everyone could see. "That's enough security for me." Lawrence's face had gone cold and hard. "Then you're a fool. And when this all falls apart, when your rancher realizes you're more trouble than you're worth, don't come crying to us for help. You've made your choice. Live with it." "I will. Gladly." They left the hotel together, Margaret's hand still in Elias's. Behind them, the Hales sat in stunned silence, their carefully planned intervention crumbling into failure. Outside, the morning sun was bright and warm despite the autumn chill. Margaret stopped on the sidewalk, turned to face Elias. "That felt good," she said. "What did?" "Choosing you, telling them I chose you, meaning it." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for letting me choose, for not making it complicated with pride or doubt or any of the things that usually ruin these moments." "I almost did. Make it complicated, I mean." "But you didn't, that's what matters." She started walking again, pulling him along. "Now we should probably get supplies and head home before I say something I'll regret to everyone else in town. You earned the right to say whatever you want." "Maybe. But I'd rather save my energy for more important things." "Like what?" "Like building the life we just defended. Like proving to ourselves, not to them, to ourselves, that we made the right choice." Elias thought about that as they loaded supplies and started the ride home. About choices and consequences and the difference between surviving and living. About how Margaret had walked into his empty house and set 2 plates on the table, and how that simple gesture had started something neither of them could have predicted. How she'd just turned down $50,000 to stay. How he'd just admitted out loud that he wanted her to. How maybe, despite all the damage and fear and careful distance, they were actually building something worth keeping. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun reached its peak, humble and imperfect and entirely theirs. Elias looked at it with new eyes, seeing not what was lacking, but what existed. A house that stayed warm, land that produced, a life being built one difficult choice at a time. Margaret saw him looking and smiled. "Home," she said simply. "Yeah," Elias agreed. "Home." And for the first time in 20 years, he meant it. The Hales left Bear Creek 2 days later, their departure marked by tight-lipped silence and a trail of dust that settled quickly on the dry road. Elias watched them go from the porch, Margaret beside him, neither of them speaking until the carriage disappeared over the ridge. "That's done then," Margaret said. "You have any regrets?" "Not one." She leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the land they'd claimed as theirs. "Though I suspect they'll tell everyone back east that I've lost my mind. Chosen poverty and isolation over civilized society. Let them tell it however they want. You know the truth." "I do." She turned to him, something thoughtful in her expression. "You know what's strange? For the first time in my life, I don't care what anyone thinks. Not the Hales, not the town, not anyone. I just care about this. About us. About what we're building." "That's not strange. That's freedom." "Is that what this feels like?" Margaret smiled. "I wasn't sure. Never had it before." The weeks that followed brought their own kind of challenges. News of Margaret's rejection of the Hales offer spread through Bear Creek with predictable speed, and opinions divided sharply. Some saw it as admirable, a woman choosing love over money. Others saw it as foolish, throwing away security for uncertain romance. Brennan and Yates remained openly hostile, but their influence began to wane as more people grew tired of their moral crusading. Jacob Whitmore and others like him, practical folks who valued hard work over social politics, started trading more openly with the Crows, establishing connections that made Yates's economic threats empty. But the real test came in early winter when Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She knew before she told him. Elias could see it in the way she moved, the way she touched her stomach absently when she thought he wasn't looking, the careful calculation in her eyes when she watched him work. Finally, one evening over supper, she said it out loud. "I'm going to have a baby." Elias's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. For a long moment, he couldn't process the words, couldn't make them fit into any version of reality he'd prepared for. "You're sure?" he managed finally. "As sure as I can be. 2 months, maybe 3. Due sometime in the spring." "And you're... how do you feel about it?" Margaret set down her own fork, met his eyes. Terrified, excited, completely unprepared, all of it at once. She paused. "How do you feel about it?" Elias tried to find words for the chaos in his head. Fear, because babies were fragile and the frontier was harsh, and 1,000 things could go wrong. Hope, because a child meant future, meant permanence, meant this marriage was becoming something neither of them could have predicted, and underneath it all, a terror so deep he could barely acknowledge it. "I don't know how to be a father," he said. "I don't know how to be a mother. Not out here. Not like this. We could fail. We could mess this up badly." "We could," Margaret agreed. "Or we could figure it out the same way we've figured out everything else, one day at a time, making mistakes and fixing them as we go. That's a hell of a way to raise a child. It's the only way we know how to do anything." She reached across the table, took his hand. "I'm scared too, Elias. But I'm also thinking that maybe two people who've survived as much as we have might actually be stronger than we give ourselves credit for. Maybe we can do this." "Maybe" isn't very reassuring. "No, but it's honest. And honest is all we've got." Elias thought about Sarah, about the child they'd almost had before the miscarriage that had broken something fundamental between them. About how he'd failed her then, failed to be what she needed, failed to provide comfort or support or anything beyond his own damaged silence. "I couldn't help Sarah," he said quietly, "when she lost the baby. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I just made everything worse. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be present, to try. That's all. And if I fail again, then we deal with it together. But Elias, you're not the same man you were with Sarah. You've changed. I've seen it. The way you talk now, the way you let me in, that's not the man who shut down and pushed everyone away." He wanted to believe her, wanted to think that 20 years and one complicated marriage had healed enough damage that he could be the kind of father a child deserved. But belief didn't come easy to someone who'd spent so long convinced of his own inadequacy. "I'll try," he said finally. "That's all I can promise. I'll try. That's enough. That's all I'm asking." Winter came hard that year, snow piling deep, and temperatures dropping low enough to freeze livestock water in hours. Margaret's pregnancy progressed despite the harsh conditions, her body changing in ways that fascinated and terrified Elias in equal measure. He caught himself watching her more often, the way she moved through the house with one hand on her growing belly, the way she talked to the baby when she thought he couldn't hear, the quiet strength in her as she adapted to the physical demands of carrying a child while maintaining a frontier household. "You're staring again," Margaret said one evening, catching him watching her knead bread. "Sorry." "Don't be. It's just interesting. You never used to pay this much attention. You weren't pregnant before." "True." She shaped the dough into loaves, set them to rise. "Are you getting used to the idea of being a father?" "Getting there, slowly." "What scares you most about it?" The question was direct enough that Elias couldn't deflect. He thought about it while she cleaned flour from her hands, while she poured coffee and sat across from him at the table they'd shared through so many conversations. "That I won't know how to love them right," he said finally. "That I'll pass on all my damage instead of anything good. That they'll grow up with a father who can't give them what they need." "You think love is something you have to know how to do? Like a skill you learn?" "Isn't it?" "Maybe partially, but mostly I think it's just showing up, being there, trying even when you're scared or uncertain. Children don't need perfect parents, they need present ones." "How do you know that?" "Because I had perfect parents by society's standards, rich, respectable, properly attentive to appearances. And I grew up feeling like a doll in their collection, pretty and proper, and completely empty inside. I would have traded all of that for one parent who actually saw me instead of what I represented." She reached across the table, took his hand. "You see me, Elias. You see people as they actually are, not as you want them to be. That's the most important thing you can give a child. And if it's not enough, then we figure out what else they need and we provide it, together. Stop thinking of this as something you have to do alone." The reminder that he wasn't alone anymore still felt strange. 20 years of solitary thinking was a hard habit to break, but Margaret's presence, steady, certain, utterly unshakable, made it easier to believe that maybe he didn't have to carry everything by himself. "Okay," he said. "Together." "Together," Margaret echoed. As winter deepened, the isolation that had once defined Elias's existence became something different. The ranch was cut off from town by snow and cold, but instead of the familiar emptiness, the house felt full. Margaret's presence, her voice, the small sounds of daily life. They filled spaces Elias hadn't realized were hollow. And slowly, carefully, he started talking about things he'd kept buried for years. One night, trapped indoors by a blizzard, he told her about Fort Stevens, about the friend who'd died, about the guilt that had shaped every decision after. Margaret listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. She just listened, present and attentive, letting him excavate memories he'd tried to bury under silence and distance. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me." "That's it? No wisdom, no perspective?" "What would I say? That it wasn't your fault? You already know that intellectually, even if you can't believe it emotionally, that he wouldn't blame you. You can't know that, and pretending you can doesn't help." She shifted closer to him on the couch they'd pulled near the fire. "I can't fix what the war did to you, Elias, but I can sit with you while you carry it. That's what I'm offering. Not solutions, just company." "Company," he repeated. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs. Someone to share the weight so it's not quite so heavy." Elias thought about that as the storm raged outside, as firelight painted the room in shifting shadows. About how Margaret had walked into his life and refused to let him hide. How she'd pushed and challenged and demanded honesty when dishonesty would have been easier. How she'd chosen him over and over, even when given every reason to leave. "I love you," he said. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. Margaret stilled, eyes wide. "What?" "I love you. I'm not good at saying it, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's true. You're the best thing that's happened to me in 20 years, maybe longer. And I don't want you to think I'm just tolerating you being here. I want you here. I choose you here. Every day." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, the first time he'd seen her cry since she'd arrived. "You've never said that before." "I know. Should have said it sooner." "No. You said it when you meant it. That matters more than timing." She wiped her eyes, laughed shakily. "I love you too, in case that wasn't obvious." "It wasn't, not to me." "Then I should say it more often. I love you, Elias Crow. Your damage and your nightmares and your 20 years of practiced isolation. All of it. I love all of it." They sat together in the firelight, holding each other while the storm tried to tear the world apart outside. But inside, everything felt solid, anchored, real in ways that had nothing to do with paper or law or social expectation, real because they'd chosen it, because they kept choosing it, every day, even when it was hard. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing land that had survived another winter. Margaret's pregnancy became obvious enough that trips to town drew comments, some congratulatory, some calculating, all noted and judged. Pauline Werner was the most direct. "Well," she said when they came in for supplies, "I suppose that settles any questions about the legitimacy of your marriage." "It was always legitimate," Margaret said calmly. "But I'm glad you're satisfied. I'm just pleased to see you two building a proper life. A baby will change things, make everything more permanent." "Things were already permanent," Elias said. "This just makes it visible." In April, 3 weeks before the baby was due, Jacob Whitmore rode out to the ranch with unexpected news. "Brennan's leaving," he said without preamble. "Got an offer from a bigger church in Denver. He's taking it." "Good riddance," Margaret said. There's more. Yates lost most of his money in a bad investment. Banks foreclosing on half his land. He won't be throwing his weight around much longer." Elias absorbed this information slowly. "So the people who've been making our lives difficult are both gone." "More or less. Won't solve everything. Town will always have gossips and troublemakers. But the organized opposition? That's done." Jacob looked between them. "Thought you'd want to know. You two earned some peace." After he left, Margaret said, "It's strange. I thought I'd feel more satisfied when they left, more vindicated. But you don't?" "I mostly just feel tired, and ready for this to be over so we can focus on what's coming instead of what's behind us." "That's probably healthy." "Probably. Doesn't make it less anticlimactic." She rubbed her lower back, grimacing. "Though I suspect the climax is still ahead. Literally." The baby came on a Tuesday morning in late April, 2 weeks early and in a hurry. Margaret woke Elias just after dawn with a hand on his shoulder and 4 quiet words. "It's time. Get help. Sut." Elias rode to town faster than he'd ever ridden, returned with Doc Harrison, a gruff man in his 60s who'd delivered half the babies in the territory, and lost his bedside manner somewhere around number 50. "Out," Harrison said when Elias tried to stay in the room. "You'll just get in the way." "She's my wife." "She's also in labor, and unless you've suddenly developed medical training I don't know about, you're more useful boiling water and staying out of my space." Elias wanted to argue, but Margaret caught his eye and nodded. "I'll be fine. Go." So he went, spent the next 6 hours pacing the kitchen while sounds from the bedroom alternately terrified and encouraged him. At one point he heard Margaret scream, a sound so raw and primal it made his hands shake. He was halfway to the bedroom door when Harrison appeared, blocking his way. "She's fine. Baby's coming. It's supposed to hurt. Go back to your pacing." "I should be there." "You should be where you won't faint and create more problems. Trust me, I've seen bigger men than you go down during childbirth. You want to help? Stay out here and let me do my job." At 2 in the afternoon, a new sound joined the chaos, a baby crying. Elias froze, every muscle locked, as the crying continued, strong, angry, very much alive. Harrison appeared in the doorway moments later, sleeves rolled up, looking tired but satisfied. "You have a daughter. Healthy lungs, all the right parts, looks like she'll be a fighter. Mother's exhausted, but fine. Give us 5 minutes to clean up, then you can come in." Those 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. When Harrison finally waved him in, Elias entered the bedroom like he was walking into church, reverent and terrified in equal measure. Margaret lay in bed, sweaty and pale and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket he recognized as one she'd mended weeks ago, was the smallest human being he'd ever encountered. "Come meet your daughter," Margaret said, voice hoarse but steady. Elias approached slowly, sat carefully on the edge of the bed. The baby, his daughter, had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused eyes, taking in a world she'd just entered. "She's so small," he said stupidly. "She'll grow. They all do." Margaret adjusted the blanket. "You want to hold her?" "I don't know how." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out." She transferred the baby into his arms with more confidence than he felt, showed him how to support the head, how to hold her securely without squeezing too tight. His daughter fit in his arms like she belonged there, like she'd always been meant to be there, and Elias had just been waiting 20 years for her to arrive. "What should we name her?" Margaret asked. Elias looked at his wife, at his daughter, at the life they'd built from nothing, and desperation and one woman's refusal to give up. "You choose. You did all the hard work." "We both did the hard work, just different kinds." Margaret reached out, touched the baby's tiny hand. "Grace. I want to call her Grace. Grace Crow." "Grace Crow," Margaret repeated, "because Grace is what we've been giving each other since the beginning. Seems right to give it to her too." Elias thought about grace, unearned kindness, second chances, mercy when judgment would have been easier. About how Margaret had given him all of that and more. How he'd tried, imperfectly, to give it back. How now they'd give it to this small person who'd done nothing to earn it but be born. "Grace," he agreed, "it's perfect." The months that followed were chaos of a different kind than Elias had ever experienced. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the endless cycle of feeding and changing and trying to decipher what a tiny human needed when she couldn't talk yet. But through it all, Margaret was there. Not perfect. She got frustrated and exhausted and sometimes cried from sheer overwhelm. But present, trying, figuring it out alongside him instead of expecting him to have answers he didn't possess. And slowly, impossibly, Elias discovered something he'd never expected. He was good at this. Not the practical parts, Margaret handled those better, drawing on instincts he didn't have, but the presence part, the showing up part, the holding Grace when she cried at 3 in the morning and just being there until she calmed down. "You're better at this than you thought," Margaret observed one night, watching him rock their daughter to sleep. "I'm terrified every second." "That's what makes you good at it. You care enough to be scared." "That doesn't make sense." "It does." Edmund wasn't scared of anything because he didn't think about consequences. He just charged ahead and hoped things worked out. But you think about everything, about how your actions affect people, about what Grace needs, about whether you're doing this right. That fear means you're paying attention. Elias looked down at Grace, who'd finally fallen asleep against his shoulder. I don't want to mess her up. Give her my damage. You won't, because you're aware of your damage, which means you can choose not to pass it on. That's what breaks the cycle. Margaret moved closer, put her hand on his back. Besides, she'll get some of my damage too. Between the two of us, she'll be thoroughly complicated, but she'll also be loved. That counts for something. It counts for everything. As Grace grew from infant to baby to small person with opinions and preferences, the ranch changed with her. The silence Elias had treasured for 20 years gave way to laughter, crying, the small sounds of a child learning to exist in the world. The town's attitude shifted too. It was hard to maintain scandal around a family that was so obviously committed to each other. People who'd been skeptical gradually became neutral. Some even became friendly. Pauline Werner, of all people, became an unexpected ally. She started setting aside small things whenever the Crows came to town. A toy for Grace, fabric Margaret had admired, extra supplies at no charge. Why are you doing this? Margaret asked one day. Pauline looked almost embarrassed. I was wrong about you two. Thought you were putting on a show, that it would fall apart once the novelty wore off. But you proved me wrong, and I respect that. Not many people stick to their choices when things get hard. Thank you for saying that. Don't thank me. Thank your husband. He's changed. Anyone with eyes can see it. Man who used to come to town looking like he was one bad day from vanishing into the mountains permanently. Now he looks like he's got reasons to come home. After Pauline walked away, Elias said, She's right, you know. About what? I did change. Because of you. Because of Grace. Because you both gave me reasons to be something more than just surviving. Margaret took his hand, the gesture so familiar now it was automatic. You gave us reasons too. A home, safety, partnership. We changed each other. That's how it's supposed to work. 2 years passed, then 3. Grace grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions and had opinions about everything. The ranch expanded as Elias found he had energy now for more than just maintenance. He started building, improving, planning for a future that included more than just getting through another winter. Margaret started teaching Grace to read, which led to teaching other children whose families had moved into the area, which led to the idea of a proper school. We could build it on the east section, she said one evening, maps spread on the table. Close enough to town that families could walk, but far enough that it's neutral territory. Not church property, not tied to any particular interest. You want to start a school. I want children to have better options than I did, better than Edmund did, better than what most people out here get, which is nothing, or religious instruction masquerading as education. She looked at him. What do you think? I think it'll cost money we don't have and time we barely have, and will probably create a whole new set of problems with people who think women shouldn't be teaching or education should be church-controlled. So you think it's a bad idea? I think it's a great idea. And I think we should do it anyway. They built the school over the course of 2 years, Elias and Margaret working alongside neighbors who'd decided the Crows weren't so strange after all, just different. Jacob Whitmore donated timber. Others contributed labor, materials, time. The school opened in the fall of Grace's 5th year, with Margaret as the teacher and 12 students ranging from 6 to 14. It was small, imperfect, constantly struggling for supplies and funding. It was also exactly what the community needed. One evening, watching Margaret work with students while Grace played nearby, Elias thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the moment he'd come home to find a stranger in his house to this, a family, a purpose, a life built on choices they'd made together. What are you thinking? Margaret asked, catching him staring again. That I almost threw you out that first night. I know, I wouldn't have blamed you. But I didn't. I sat down instead. One decision that changed everything. Best decision you ever made, Margaret said with a smile. Second best. The best was asking you to stay. Third best was marrying me. Fourth best was having Grace. We could keep going, Margaret laughed. List all the good decisions until we run out of numbers. Or we could just acknowledge we've made a lot of good decisions. Together. Together, Margaret agreed. That night, after Grace was asleep and the house was quiet, Elias stood on the porch, looking out at land that had once felt like prison and now felt like home. Margaret joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting me in. For not throwing me out that first night. For giving me a chance when you had every reason not to. I should be thanking you. You're the one who stayed, who kept pushing even when I tried to retreat, who believed this could be something more than just survival." "We both believed. Eventually." She leaned against him. "Though I'll admit, there were moments I doubted. When the Hales came with their offer. When I was pregnant and terrified. When Grace was born and I didn't know what I was doing. But you stayed anyway. Because leaving would have meant giving up on the best thing that ever happened to me. And I'm stubborn enough to fight for what I want. Lucky for me." They stood together in the darkness, watching stars emerge against the deepening sky. Somewhere inside, Grace made a small sound in her sleep. The school they'd built sat silent and solid on the eastern section. The ranch stretched out around them, no longer empty but full of possibility. Elias thought about the man he'd been 20 years ago, damaged and isolated, convinced that solitude was the only safe option, about how wrong he'd been, how loneliness and safety weren't the same thing, how the real danger wasn't in letting people in, but in keeping them out so long you forgot how to be human. "I love you," he said, "in case I haven't mentioned it recently. You mentioned it this morning, and yesterday, and the day before." Margaret smiled up at him. "But I don't mind hearing it again." "Good, because I plan to keep saying it for the next 40 or 50 years, if you'll put up with me that long. I'll put up with you longer than that. You're stuck with me, Elias Crow. For better or worse, in poverty and health, until one of us stops breathing. That's not how the vows go. It's how our vows go. We've never done anything the conventional way. Why start now?" Elias pulled her closer, felt her warmth against him, her steady heartbeat that had become as familiar as his own. "Fine by me. Conventional's overrated anyway." Years continued to pass, marked not by dramatic events, but by the steady accumulation of daily life. Grace grew, learned, became a person with her own thoughts and dreams. The school expanded, the ranch prospered. The community that had once judged the Crows gradually accepted them, then respected them, then couldn't quite remember why they'd ever had objections in the first place. On Grace's 10th birthday, Elias found himself at the table, the same table where he'd first sat across from Margaret, surrounded by people. Grace and her friends. Margaret, neighbors who'd become something like family. The house was loud and chaotic, and the furthest thing from the silence he'd once treasured. It was perfect. That night, after everyone had gone and Grace was asleep and the house was finally quiet, Margaret sat beside him on the porch. "You did good," she said. "With what?" "All of it. The party. Being a father. Building a life worth celebrating. All of it. We did good. Both of us." "True." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how it started? How random it was that I walked into your house that day?" "Not random. You needed a place to stay. I happened to have one." "But you could have thrown me out. Most men would have." "Most men aren't as smart as me." Margaret laughed. "There's the arrogance I married." "It's not arrogance if it's true. Letting you stay was the smartest thing I ever did. Everything good in my life came from that one decision. Everything good in my life came from refusing to leave, from setting 2 plates on the table and cooking supper like I belonged there." "You did belong there. You just didn't know it yet." "Neither did you." "No," Elias admitted. "But I figured it out eventually." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The land that had witnessed their entire unlikely journey stretched out around them, constant and enduring. "I used to think I'd die alone," Elias said quietly. "That I'd earned it somehow. That isolation was the price for surviving when others didn't. And now? Now I think I might die surrounded by people who actually care whether I'm here or not, and that terrifies me less than it used to." "Because you've learned you're worth caring about?" "Because I've learned that being cared about isn't a burden. It's a gift, one I'm finally ready to accept." Margaret lifted her head, looked at him in the darkness. "That's the most profound thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it. I'm not usually this articulate." "I know. That's why I'm savoring it." She kissed him, simple and warm and familiar. "Come to bed. Tomorrow's another day and it'll come too early. It always does. They went inside together, checked on Grace one last time. She was sprawled across her bed the way children sleep, completely relaxed and utterly trusting that the world would still be there when she woke. In their room, Elias lay beside Margaret and thought about trust, about how it had taken him 40 years to learn it, about how one uninvited stranger had taught him more about living than 20 years of solitude ever had, about how the best things in life were the ones you didn't see coming, the ones you almost rejected but chose instead, the ones you built slowly, imperfectly, day by day, until they became so solid you couldn't imagine life without them. "I'm glad you stayed," he said into the darkness. "I'm glad you let me," Margaret replied. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The story of Elias Crow and Margaret Hale didn't end with dramatic gestures or grand declarations. It ended the way most real stories end, with two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, choosing each other again and again, building a life that was messy and difficult and absolutely worth it. They grew old together on that Montana ranch, raised their daughter and eventually grandchildren, built a school that outlasted them both, became the kind of couple people pointed to when they wanted to believe that love could survive hardship, that choices mattered, that it was never too late to start over. And it all began with a woman who walked into an empty house, set 2 plates on a table, and refused to leave. And a man who, against every instinct he had, chose to sit down.